That evening, as footsteps of mourning echoed through my house, my brother insisted he had come to support me. His hand rested on my shoulder like it had in childhood, as if we were once again allies against the world. But the night always reveals more than the eyes are willing to see in daylight. I got up to fetch a glass of water and heard the creak of a door that should not have been open. A faint light glowed in my daughter-in-law's room, and in that light, I saw something that erased every word he had spoken about support. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Davis. I was 73 when the house began to fall silent. I had spent most of my life teaching American history at a public high school in a quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. For 38 years, I talked to teenagers about revolutions, wars, and forgotten presidents. I liked dates, structure, the logic of timelines. But nothing in history had prepared me for what silence sounded like when it filled every inch of a home you built for your family. The day we buried my son, the autumn wind had turned sharp. It wasn't the cold that bothered me. It was the stillness that came after the guests left. The kind of stillness that makes your skin feel thin. The front door had barely clicked shut behind the last pair of feet when I stood in the middle of the living room and realized I didn't know what to do with my arms. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. I had paid the mortgage for over 30 years, replaced the roof myself when I was still strong enough to climb it, painted these walls every spring, even when my knees had begun to complain. But it felt like my presence no longer belonged here. The furniture stood in place, like strangers who didn't know where to sit. The walls echoed every sound: my breath, the squeak of a floorboard, the ticking of the old clock above the fireplace, as if they too were waiting for someone who wouldn't return. I went into the kitchen and opened the cabinet out of habit. The mugs were all there, 2 chipped, one stained inside from years of coffee. His favorite one, the blue one with the faded NASA logo, sat untouched. I didn't move it. I just closed the door again. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. The refrigerator hummed low and steady, a mechanical sound that reminded me the world still functioned even if I didn't. I opened it, not to take anything, but just to prove to myself that something inside the house still responded. The milk had expired. I left it. I wandered into the hallway. His boots were still by the back door. My son had large feet, like mine. I used to joke that we were a family of big-footed men, always dragging the dirt in with us. Now they stood there, like a monument. I couldn't bring myself to move them. I walked to the den and stood in the doorway, looking at the couch he used to fall asleep on. His last night here, he had fallen asleep with the remote in his hand. I hadn't known then it would be the last time. I hadn't touched the blanket he left bunched up at the edge. The indentation in the cushion had begun to fade. I didn't sit there. Upstairs, the hallway smelled like laundry detergent and old wood. I opened the door to his room and stood in the frame. Everything was in place. His desk, his books, the shirt draped over the chair. His scent still lingered faintly, something between cedar and sweat. I took one step in, then another, until I stood in the center of the room. I reached out to touch the desk, then stopped short. My hand hovered in the air, unsure whether to make contact or retreat. I turned and left. Back downstairs, I sat at the dining table. At the the long one I built myself from reclaimed oak planks when the kids were little. I remembered sanding it down for days, staining it late at night, while my wife scolded me for not getting enough sleep. It had 8 chairs then. Now only 2 were used regularly, then 1. The table still bore a faint ring from when he once placed a hot pot down without a trivet. I used to scold him for it. Now I ran my finger around the circle again and again, like it was a clock I could rewind. The house was too quiet. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of things unsaid, the weight of all the mornings we would never have, the lunches he wouldn't pop in for, the birthday dinners I'd always cook, even when he insisted on takeout. I made tea and carried it back to the living room. I didn't drink it. It just sat there on the side table, steaming gently into the stillness. I turned on the lamp next to my chair, not because I needed the light, but because the shadows had started to move in a way I didn't trust. The photograph on the mantel caught my eye. It was the three of us, me, him, and my wife, on the porch during a summer long gone. She had one arm around his waist, her smile slightly tilted. I looked younger in that photo. I didn't recognize myself. I lifted the frame, stared at it, and set it back down. The phone rang once that evening. A neighbor offering condolences. I listened, nodded, thanked them with the kind of voice people use at funerals, soft, clipped, measured. When I hung up, the silence returned heavier than before. I went to bed early that night, not because I was tired, but because the day had nothing left to say. I lay on top of the blankets, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. It made a soft clicking sound every time it passed the wobble in its rotation. My son always said he'd fix it. Somewhere in the night, I got up and walked the hallway again. I paused in front of his door, but didn't go in. Instead, I walked into the spare room and stood by the window. The street outside was empty. A single porch light flickered across the road, casting shadows that twitched like memories. I stood there until the first signs of morning began to press against the dark. The sky lightened, but the weight in my chest didn't. The world was moving forward without him, but my house had been left behind. Everything inside these walls still held the shape of his absence, and I knew this was only the beginning. I hadn't seen my brother in almost 5 years when he showed up at my door the morning after the service. His voice on the phone had come late the previous night, low and full of something I didn't yet recognize. Grief, maybe, or guilt. He said he would come in the morning. I didn't ask questions. I simply said, "All right," and hung up. The silence that followed was familiar, like an old blanket I didn't know how to throw away. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I noticed he looked older than I remembered. His hair, once thick and dark like mine used to be, had turned completely silver. His posture had softened, rounded at the shoulders, and his eyes had that dimness that comes not from age, but from avoidance. He didn't offer flowers or a casserole, just his presence. And in that moment, it felt like enough. He stepped inside, slowly, as though uncertain whether he belonged in this house. I motioned for him to come in, and he moved past me, carrying the scent of travel, old leather, roadside coffee, and something stale beneath it all. He glanced around the foyer as if memorizing a place he would only occupy for a short time. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he placed his hand on my shoulder. It was a quiet gesture, one that pulled me back decades to a time when we were both boys, and that same hand had gripped me after our mother's funeral. Back then, it meant something like solidarity. Now it felt more like rehearsal. We sat in the living room for a long while, saying very little. I poured 2 cups of coffee, both black. He drank his with both hands, eyes fixed on the framed photos on the mantel. His gaze landed on the one with my son, young, smiling, arms crossed like he thought the world couldn't touch him. My brother's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought he might speak, but he didn't. He just kept sipping. I noticed how comfortable he looked in the armchair, as if he'd sat in it before, even though I knew he hadn't. The way he leaned back, stretched his legs out, tapped his fingers on the armrest. It all felt too natural, too practiced. I wanted to shake the feeling off, blame it on grief, on imagination. But the unease stayed with me, like a stone in my shoe. He asked if he could stay for a few days. I nodded. I didn't think it would be right to say no. We were the only two left from our side of the family. Our parents were gone. My wife had passed years ago, and now my son was gone, too. It felt obscene to turn away blood, even if that blood had run cold between us for a long time. I led him to the guest room. He placed his overnight bag on the bed and opened the curtains like he was settling in. I lingered in the doorway, watching him take in the room, the soft green wallpaper my wife had picked out when we first bought the house. He ran his hand along the dresser and smiled faintly. There was something in that smile that made me uncomfortable, something too familiar. I turned and walked away. That evening, we ate leftovers at the kitchen table. The clink of forks on plates filled the space where conversation should have been. He asked questions that grazed the surface. How long had it been since the diagnosis? Where the burial was held? Who attended the service? I answered without elaboration. I didn't want to talk about my son as a timeline. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I let him. I sat on the porch, watching the last light disappear behind the neighbor's house, listening to the hum of insects and the occasional passing car. I heard the water running inside, the clatter of plates, the opening and closing of cabinets. He didn't ask where things were. He moved like he already knew. Later that night, I found him in the living room, standing in front of the mantel. He was staring at a different photo now, one of my wife, taken the year before she passed. She was smiling gently, looking off to the side, as if amused by something just out of frame. My brother tilted his head, studying her, and when he realized I was watching him, he stepped back and cleared his throat. He said the house hadn't changed much. I told him it didn't need to. He didn't respond, just gave a slow nod, like he was agreeing with something only he could hear. Before we turned in for the night, he asked if I needed anything. I said no. He touched my shoulder again, the same hand, the same pressure. It lingered a second too long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. I heard the pipes shift. I heard a door close gently, not mine. I convinced myself it was nothing. The house was old. Old houses have their own language. But deep in my chest, something stirred. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to recognition. A voice I hadn't heard in years, whispering in the spaces between my thoughts, telling me to pay attention. In the morning, I found him already dressed, sipping coffee in the kitchen like it was his routine. He greeted me warmly, as though the night hadn't left a trace. I smiled back, but it felt like my face was wearing someone else's skin. He offered to take a walk around the neighborhood. I declined. I said I needed to take care of a few things. He nodded and stepped outside, alone. When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house exhaled with me. It had started to feel like a stranger in its own skin. And I didn't know yet what that meant, but I knew I had to stay still long enough to find out. His hand on my shoulder was meant to comfort, but all I felt was its weight. The third night was when the house began to whisper, not in voices or creaks, not in the way old pipes groaned or hinges gave way under the weight of memory. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of silence that followed you like a shadow, a presence with no form, a weight that hung in the air long after the footsteps stopped. I had gone to bed early, not out of exhaustion, but because I didn't know what else to do. The days had blurred into each other. Grief does that. It makes time soft around the edges. The sun came and went behind the blinds, and I only noticed its absence when the lamps needed turning on. That night, I left the light in the hallway on. It was a habit from years ago, when my wife would move through the house at odd hours checking windows, refolding laundry, rechecking the locks even if I already had. She said the light made the house feel alive. I hadn't turned it on in years. but something about the quiet made me want to see shapes more clearly. The guest room door was shut. I had seen my brother retreat there after dinner, carrying a glass of water and a book he hadn't opened once since arriving. He had said goodnight at the foot of the stairs, his voice low, hands deep in his pockets. I had answered with a nod, and we parted ways as if we were only temporary guests in each other's lives. My bedroom was at the end of the hall. I kept the door open, as I always did. The lamp on my nightstand cast a muted glow over the wooden floor. The carpet runner had worn thin in places. I had meant to replace it years ago, but never got around to it. Now I found myself staring at those faded fibers, wondering how many times my son had run down this very path. How many nights he had tiptoed past my door as a boy, thinking he was quiet. He never was. I lay in bed, but didn't pull the blanket over me. I stared at the ceiling fan, turning slowly above, its hum uneven and soft. The room was neither warm nor cold, just still. My ears searched for sound, but the quiet had grown too thick to break. It wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. At some point I sat up. I don't know why. Maybe I heard something I didn't register, or maybe my body responded before my thoughts caught up. I rose, stepped into the hallway, and paused. The light overhead flickered just once, enough to shift the shadows. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, narrow and lined with old photographs. My family's faces stared back. My wife in a summer dress, my son on a swing, me younger and thinner, trying to look confident. The frames hadn't moved in years, but that night they seemed too straight, too silent, as if they had secrets they weren't sharing. The air smelled different. There was still the faint scent of wood polish and the lavender sachet I kept in my closet, but something unfamiliar floated beneath it. Something faintly floral, synthetic, too modern for this house. It took me a moment to place it, my daughter-in-law's perfume. She had always worn it too strongly, like armor, but tonight it came in subtle waves, like smoke that had already begun to disperse. I walked slowly, heel to toe, careful not to make the floor complain. Every board in this house had a language. I knew which ones groaned and which ones whispered. I stayed to the edges, avoiding the plank outside the linen closet that always betrayed me. As I passed the guest room door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. The light inside was off. I thought I heard breathing, but I wasn't sure if it was his or mine. I didn't linger. I kept walking. Halfway down the hallway, I paused outside the room that used to be my son's. I hadn't gone in since the service. The door was closed, but I reached out and rested my palm against it. The wood was cool. Nothing stirred on the other side. I stood there for a long time, hand flat, as if waiting for it to speak. I turned and faced the room across the hall. Hers. The door was open just a sliver. A warm light glowed from within, faint and flickering. I leaned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of the soft edges of her nightstand lamp. That's when I noticed the shadow. It moved, not quickly, not abruptly, but enough to shift the pattern of light on the far wall. It was tall, taller than her, broader. It moved in a way that didn't match her graceful rhythm. It wasn't hers. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat and stayed there. I blinked, hoping the shape would resolve into something familiar, but it didn't. I saw the edge of a shoulder, the side of a face. The hand that reached up wasn't feminine. The shape that leaned in wasn't hers. And then it was gone, hidden again behind the curtain of the wall. I backed away slowly, every part of my body stiff. The silence in the hallway had thickened. It pressed against my skin, heavy with knowledge I hadn't asked for. I returned to my room like a thief in reverse, retreating from the scene of someone else's crime. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands clasped tight between my knees. The hallway behind me remained lit, but I couldn't look back at it. I stared at the floor and tried to push the image from my mind. but it clung to me like a stain, soaking in before I could build a barrier. The silence in the hallway was no longer hollow. It had been filled, not with grief, not with sorrow, but with the weight of something unspoken, something that didn't belong in this house, something that had crept in quietly and made itself at home. The rain began softly that night. It tapped against the kitchen window while I stood at the sink, rinsing a cup I hadn't used. I don't know why I washed it. No one else was awake, and the house had long since gone quiet, each room folding into its own shadow. But the act gave my hands something to do. It distracted me from the stillness that was growing heavier with each hour. I had trouble sleeping again. The bed felt unfamiliar, too wide, too cold. I had left the television on earlier to drown out my thoughts, but even its background noise started to sound too sharp. I turned it off and sat in the armchair near the curtained window, listening to the sound of the rain growing steadier, more insistent. At some point, I rose and made my way through the darkened house, barefoot, careful. The hallway stretched ahead of me, painted in amber light from the small fixture above the linen closet. The bulb buzzed faintly, something I'd meant to fix months ago. I moved slowly, one hand trailing along the wall, fingers brushing the paint that had cracked near the baseboard. When I reached the end of the hallway, I hesitated. There was a familiar smell in the air again, faint and floral, that same synthetic sweetness I had noticed before. I turned toward the guest room and saw the door shut tightly. No light there, no sound. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the rhythm of the rain, the small creaks of the old house shifting beneath the weather. I turned around and walked past the room that used to belong to my son. The door remained closed. I didn't touch it. My eyes moved instead toward the far end of the hallway, where her room stood, just off the corner of the stairs. That's when I saw it. A thin, unmistakable sliver of light beneath her door. It was soft and golden, the kind of light that comes from a lamp without a shade, the kind that spills across wood like a whisper. At first, I thought she'd simply forgotten to turn it off. She often read late into the night. She liked those paperback novels with the creased covers and quiet endings. But something in the stillness didn't feel right. I took a step closer. The floor beneath my feet groaned, but only slightly. I paused, listening. Nothing moved behind the door. No shifting, no footsteps, no quiet murmur of someone reading aloud. I took another step. The light remained steady. From where I stood, the space beneath the door seemed impossibly alive. I could see the outline of something, a shadow maybe, flashing briefly across the golden bar of light. Then it disappeared again. I held my breath. The rain outside had become more insistent, like fingers drumming against the roof. In its rhythm, I thought I heard something else, a sound I couldn't place, a whisper or a laugh or the brief creak of bed springs. I told myself it was nothing. The mind hears what it wants to when the heart is uneasy, but the light told me more than the sounds ever could. I stepped back into the darkness of the hallway. I didn't make a sound. My hands were cold. My breath came shallow, quiet. I leaned slightly forward, trying to hear, trying to see without seeing. The silence from within the room was too thick, too practiced. It was the kind of silence people wear when they think no one is listening. I watched the light a moment longer. Another shadow passed by. It didn't have her movements. It didn't carry her weight. There was no mistaking the way it moved. Deliberate, slow, confident. A presence that didn't belong there, at least not at that hour, not under that roof. I turned and walked away. My footsteps were careful, as though I didn't want to disturb the very betrayal I had just glimpsed. I returned to the living room, stood by the fireplace, and stared at the darkened screen of the television. I didn't sit. I couldn't. My legs felt locked beneath me, not from weakness, but from restraint. I placed my hand on the edge of the mantel, steadying myself, feeling the grooves in the wood where my son had once carved his initials as a boy. I looked at the photograph again, the same one I always saw, but rarely noticed. My son, my wife, and I on the front porch, years ago. My brother wasn't in it. He never liked to be photographed. He said still images made him feel trapped. I closed my eyes and tried to silence the images that had formed in my mind. The light, the movement, the unbearable suggestion of familiarity between two people who should never have known each other beyond grief. I opened my eyes and stared into the reflection in the dark glass of the television. It stared back, tired, older than I remembered, but alert. The kind of face that had seen enough not to need confirmation. The light beneath her door eventually disappeared. I didn't watch it fade. I stood there long enough to know that it had. Then I went back down the hallway, slower this time. The floor creaked less. I passed the closed door of the guest room again. It looked no different. Nothing looked different. But everything had changed. I entered my room and shut the door behind me, something I rarely did. I didn't turn on the lamp. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the last of the rain settle into a soft mist against the windows. I didn't try to explain away what I had seen. I didn't try to question it. I simply let it settle, let it take root like a seed beneath the surface of soil. There would be time to name it later. For now, there was only the memory of that quiet bar of light beneath her door, and the way it pulsed, like a heartbeat I was never meant to hear. The next morning arrived without ceremony. The sky hung low and pale above the backyard, where the trees stood motionless, heavy with last night's rain. Nothing moved except the soft breath of wind bending the smallest leaves. I watched it all from the kitchen window, a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, untouched. It had been hours since I poured it. I didn't remember the sound of the kettle, didn't recall measuring out the grounds or pressing the button on the machine. My body moved on a path laid down by decades of repetition, but my mind had splintered off into another place entirely. I couldn't unsee the light beneath that door. I couldn't unfeel the knowing that had entered my chest like smoke, curling between my ribs, staining everything. It had settled in me without permission. Not a suspicion, not an assumption. It was knowledge, quiet, complete, and irreversible. I tried to focus on the simplest tasks, folding a dish towel, opening the blinds, checking the mail slot, but my hands betrayed me. They moved too slowly, or too quickly. I dropped a spoon, and the sound of it clattering on the tile startled me like a gunshot. My breath caught in my throat and refused to come easily again. I stood in the center of the kitchen and stared at the floor as if it could answer me. When I finally turned, I found my brother sitting at the dining table flipping through the newspaper. He was already dressed, his hair still wet from the shower, combed neatly to one side. He looked calm, not peaceful, not joyful, just perfectly neutral, like a man who had slept well and had a list of things to accomplish. He looked up and nodded at me. His eyes betrayed nothing. I nodded back, my face hollow. She joined us minutes later, dressed in a soft gray sweater I hadn't seen before. It wasn't her usual style. It looked like something borrowed. She moved quickly, almost cheerfully, talking about the weather, about how the rain might return by evening. She placed a plate in front of my brother, and he thanked her in that low, smooth tone he used when he wanted to sound casual. I sat down without a word. The sounds around me, cutlery scraping plates, the pages of the newspaper rustling, the low hum of the refrigerator, blurred into a soft noise that pressed against my ears like cotton. I was surrounded by movement, but none of it touched me. I could see their mouths moving, the corners of their lips turning, the dance of eyes and hands and faces as they performed something they believed I couldn't see through. But I wasn't watching for words. I was watching for what lived underneath them. I left the table before breakfast was finished. I carried my cup of coffee outside, into the backyard, where the grass was still damp. The sky threatened more rain, but I didn't care. I sat in the old wooden chair beneath the oak tree and stared at the ground. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? I had no proof, no photographs, no recordings, no confessions. Just a shard of light under a door and the instinctive knowledge that something had shifted beneath my feet. That something intimate and unspeakable had happened in my house, in the space I still dared to call a home. I thought of my son. I thought of his voice, the way he used to call me Dad, like it still meant something sacred. I thought of how he trusted both of them, his wife, his uncle. I thought of the dinners we'd had in this yard, the arguments, the birthdays, the simple evenings where silence meant comfort and not tension. What would he have said if he had seen what I had seen? That question would not leave me. It clung to my thoughts like burrs on a coat. It scraped against every memory, every corner of this house. I walked the perimeter of the yard twice, 3 times, my coffee cold in my hand, my feet sinking slightly in the soft earth. I bent to pick up a fallen branch and held it for a moment, then let it drop. I didn't know what I was doing. I was moving because staying still would have meant collapsing. By mid-afternoon, I had retreated to the garage. The space was cluttered with old boxes, rusted tools, leftover lumber from projects long abandoned. I sat on the step near the water heater and stared at the shelves lined with dusty jars and empty paint cans. The smell of motor oil and wet cement filled the space. It was a different kind of silence in there, not the suffocating silence of the hallway, but something dull and heavy, like a blanket pulled too tightly over your face. I stayed there for over an hour. When I came back into the house, it was quiet again. I walked past the living room and caught a glimpse of her curled up in the armchair, legs tucked beneath her, a book in hand. She didn't look up. The lamp next to her cast a warm glow over her face. She looked soft, ordinary, entirely human, and yet I felt nothing but cold rising up my spine. He was nowhere to be seen. I went upstairs, back to my room. I closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at my hands. I had built so much with these hands: furniture, fences, a family, and now I couldn't think of a single thing I could do with them. Knowledge is not always power. Sometimes it is paralysis. Sometimes it is poison. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and took out the old photo album I hadn't touched in years. I flipped through the pages slowly. My son as a baby, laughing. My wife, sunlit on the porch. My brother and I, teenagers leaning against the hood of my father's car, arms crossed, proud and foolish. I studied his face in that picture. There was something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before, a tilt in his smile that suddenly felt sharper. I closed the album and set it on my lap. The house felt different now. It no longer breathed with the same rhythm. It watched me. It held its breath. I didn't speak of what I saw. Not that day. Not the next. I held it inside me, like a coal that never cooled. I watched them move through the house, each in their own way, and I learned the difference between suspicion and knowing. I had crossed the line, and there was no way back. The light under the door had revealed something irreversible. It hadn't screamed or confessed or begged for forgiveness. It had only glowed, and in that glow, I saw the shape of betrayal, quiet, bare, and unbearable. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time had been diluted in cold water. Everything I did felt like walking through syrup, sluggish, sticky, clouded by something unseen, but always felt. The sun rose and set without fanfare. The clocks ticked forward like they didn't notice anything had changed. But I noticed. Every moment, every second, every glance exchanged across the dining room, every footstep on the stairs, every laugh that came just a little too easily. They didn't speak of anything. They didn't need to. Their silence said more than words could. And I didn't ask. I didn't confront. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply became a watcher in my own home. In the mornings, I would find her in the kitchen, making coffee. She always poured 2 cups. Hers was pale with cream and sugar, his black and steaming. I no longer joined them. I waited until I heard their chairs scrape back from the table, until the water ran in the sink, until the quiet returned. Then I would make my way in, hands cold from holding myself still, breath shallow, heart heavy. I told myself I was gathering strength, but the truth was simpler than that. I didn't know what to do. My brother stayed longer than he said he would. At first, he spoke of work, of needing just a few more days to finish some remote project. Then he stopped giving reasons altogether. He began folding himself into the routines of the house, like a man unpacking more than just luggage. He would fix small things, tighten a doorknob, change a light bulb, adjust a squeaky hinge. Each gesture was polite, thoughtful, designed to appear helpful. But I saw something else in it. I saw territory being mapped. I saw comfort where there should have been caution. I watched him from the living room as he stood in the backyard, talking on the phone. His posture was relaxed, his voice low. I couldn't make out the words, but the way his hand gestured, the way he paced slowly near the flower beds, told me that he had forgotten this wasn't his space. Or maybe he hadn't. Maybe he had decided it no longer mattered. She started leaving the door to her room open during the day. Before, she always kept it closed. I would pass by and see her sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair, folding laundry, texting on her phone. It was all perfectly mundane. And yet, that door open just wide enough felt like a message, like a signal that what had happened was no longer hidden, only unspoken. Sometimes I caught the 2 of them in the same room, her at the stove, him leaning against the counter, both laughing at something private, or her on the porch with a book while he read a magazine beside her, their chairs angled ever so slightly toward one another. Nothing obscene, nothing outwardly wrong, but every moment between them held a softness, a rhythm, a practiced closeness that should not have been there. It made my chest ache. At night, I would lie in bed and listen to the house. I had come to know its sounds intimately over the years. The groan of the staircase, the rattle of the vent near the guest room, the soft whir of the refrigerator downstairs. But now, there were new sounds, the ones that didn't belong to wood or wire. Footsteps too soft to be random. A door clicking shut when it should have stayed open. A creak from the hallway, followed by silence too dense to ignore. I kept a journal on my nightstand. I didn't write in it. I only opened it, stared at the first blank page, and closed it again. Words refused to come. Not because I didn't have them, but because the act of writing them down would make everything real. More real than I was ready to admit. One morning, I found my brother standing in the garage, staring at the old shelves I had built years ago. He turned when he saw me and said he was thinking of organizing the tools, making better use of the space. I nodded, but said nothing. I watched him touch the old hammer my son had once used to build a birdhouse. He didn't recognize it, or if he did, he didn't let it show. He moved past it, picked up a box of screws, and began sorting them into jars. Later that afternoon, I walked into the living room and found her curled up on the couch beneath the same blanket my wife had once favored. It was a soft navy fleece with small embroidered corners. My wife used to pull it over her knees on cold nights when we watched old black and white films together. Seeing it draped over my daughter-in-law felt like a violation, though I couldn't explain why. She looked up at me and smiled. I returned the smile with a stiff nod and turned away. In the evenings, I sat outside on the porch, listening to the wind in the trees and watching the way the light faded over the neighborhood. The sky turned from gold to purple to ash. the world kept turning. Somewhere, normal people were eating dinner, watching the news, telling their children to brush their teeth, and I sat with knowledge I didn't ask for, that had lodged in my body like a shard of glass under the skin. I stopped answering phone calls, friends from the church, old co-workers, neighbors who wanted to offer help or sympathy. I let their voicemails pile up. I couldn't speak to them. What would I say? That the worst part of losing my son wasn't the grief, but the betrayal that followed in his absence? On the fourth night, I dreamed of him. He stood in the hallway, his back turned to me, facing the closed door of her room. I tried to call out, to warn him, but no sound came from my mouth. He reached for the handle, and I woke before he could turn it. I sat up in bed, the sheets damp beneath me, my chest tight. I stared at the wall across from me until the sky outside began to lighten. The house was still. Not peacefully so, but like a predator holding its breath. I had lived long enough to know what the erosion of trust feels like. It doesn't explode. It leaks, slowly, quietly. Until one day you wake up and realize the floor beneath you is hollow. These were the days after. The days of half smiles, empty rooms, long silences, and small betrayals that grew larger by the hour. I kept moving. I made tea. I fed the birds. I swept the porch. I smiled when they looked at me. But inside, something had begun to shift. Not anger, not revenge, not yet, but awareness, a slow, growing, unbearable clarity. And once you see the truth, you can never look away again. I spent much of those days drifting between rooms, not looking for anything in particular, just moving. The house had become both a sanctuary and a prison, each corner echoing with the weight of memory. I would pause by the stairs and run my hand along the banister, feeling the grooves my son had carved into the wood as a boy. He used to drag toy trucks up and down those steps, leaving small dents in the railing. I never sanded them out. I called them proof of life. The past had begun to rise like mist from the floorboards. It seeped through my thoughts, not as nostalgia, but as something heavier, more loaded. I couldn't walk into a room without being followed by ghosts, not literal ones, but the kind that wore familiar clothes, spoke with familiar voices, and left behind familiar warmth that the present could no longer offer. In the hallway closet, I found an old sweater that belonged to my brother, not the one he brought with him on this visit, but one from decades ago. A heavy wool thing with worn elbows and a faint smell of smoke and pine. It must have been left here from one of his visits when the kids were young. I held it up, and for a moment, I could almost hear his younger voice laughing in the backyard, trying to teach my son how to catch a baseball. I remembered standing at the window watching them, coffee in hand, my wife beside me, her shoulder warm against mine. I thought then that family was a kind of insurance against time. I folded the sweater carefully and placed it back where I found it. It didn't belong to this version of him, not anymore. Down in the basement, I dug through boxes labeled in my wife's tidy handwriting. Summer clothes, Christmas lights, old files. In one marked Photos Misc, I found a stack of old prints rubber-banded together. They smelled faintly of mildew and time. I carried them upstairs and spread them across the kitchen table like cards in a game I didn't know how to play. There we were, me, my brother, my wife, my son. Year after year, house after house, moment after moment captured in light and paper. I found one taken on my back porch, my brother with his arm around me, both of us smiling in the sun, sweat on our brows, the grill smoking behind us. I remembered that day, a 4th of July. My wife had made lemonade that was too sour, and we drank it anyway. My brother brought fireworks and set them off too early, scaring the neighbor's dog. We laughed until we couldn't breathe. I stared at that photograph longer than the others. I studied his face, the way his eyes squinted against the sun, the casual lean of his body toward mine. There had been a time when I trusted him implicitly. We had shared rooms, secrets, scraped knees, and adolescent dreams. When we were boys, we made up stories about running away to the woods and living off the land. When we were teenagers, we talked about road trips we'd never take. As young men, we drank too much together on my wedding night. He gave a toast that made my wife laugh and made me tear up. And when my son was born, he was the first one at the hospital with flowers and a joke about how the baby already looked like me. He had been there for so much, and now, here he was again, but not in the way that mattered. I flipped through more photos, my son with cake on his face, my wife in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, hair tied back with a red bandana, my brother at the edge of the frame, always slightly turned away from the lens. He never liked full attention. He said he preferred to observe. Now I wondered what he had been observing all those years, what parts of my life he had quietly studied, where his gaze had lingered when I wasn't looking. I found an old letter tucked inside one of the photo envelopes. It was addressed to me, but I had never opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably my wife's. I unfolded it with trembling hands. The ink had faded in places. It wasn't long, just a short note about groceries, a reminder to fix the back gate, and a small heart she had drawn next to my name. But it undid me. That small heart, that gentle, familiar shape. She had trusted me. We had built this home together, anchored it in trust, in effort, in compromise, and grace. And now, that foundation trembled under my feet. I put the photos away and returned to the living room. The late afternoon light spilled across the carpet in wide gold bands. Dust floated in the air like memories refusing to settle. I sat in my usual chair and tried to still my mind, but it wandered back, uninvited, to that summer when my brother stayed with us for 3 weeks after his divorce. My wife cooked for him every night. He helped with house repairs. He joked that he was earning his keep. Back then, I had thought of it as family pulling together. But now, looking back, I remembered the quiet way she looked at him once over dinner. Just a moment. A glance. It hadn't meant anything to me at the time, but now it replayed in my mind with unbearable clarity. Had something started then? Or was I simply poisoning every memory now with what I had come to know? I stood and went to the window. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same houses, same cars, same tree out front that had lost a large branch in a storm a decade ago and never quite recovered. I wondered if the neighbors could see what was happening in my house. I wondered if they ever noticed the way people drift toward betrayal like moths to warmth. The memories didn't stop. They came in waves, each one crashing harder than the last. I remembered my brother comforting me after my wife died. He had flown in the same night, brought bourbon, and sat with me in the garage while I said nothing. I remembered her funeral, how he stood beside me, hand on my shoulder, as if anchoring me to something solid. I remembered the way she looked that day, still pale, too quiet. And I remembered wondering why he cried more than I did. Maybe I had been blind for longer than I wanted to admit. Maybe the past had always contained the seeds of what was now blooming. And maybe memory itself was the cruelest part of aging, not because it faded, but because it sharpened with time. I returned to my chair and closed my eyes. The past swirled behind my lids like smoke. I couldn't touch it. I couldn't change it, but it held me all the same. There were no answers in those memories, only shadows. And shadows, I was beginning to understand, could stretch across years without ever being seen. It was astonishing, really, how smoothly people could wear a mask, how easily they could step into roles that looked like kindness, like civility, like family. I watched it play out every day under my own roof, the polite conversations, the shared laughter, the familiar movements that mimicked normalcy. But beneath the surface, everything was off by a fraction of a degree. Enough that you could almost convince yourself you were imagining it. Almost. He became more helpful as the days went on. My brother made himself indispensable. He cleaned the gutters, organized the garage, fixed a cabinet hinge that had been loose for years. He carried in groceries before I could offer, repaired a garden hose without being asked, even offered to repaint the porch swing when the weather warmed. It was a performance of usefulness, a demonstration, one designed for me. Or perhaps to protect himself from his own guilt, though I wasn't sure he felt any. She mirrored him. She baked banana bread one morning and left a slice on a napkin beside my chair. She asked if I needed anything when she came back from the store. She folded my laundry when I left it in the dryer too long. None of it seemed out of place, not on the surface, but the gestures were too smooth, too rehearsed, as though they weren't acts of love or habit, but cover stories. I studied them more closely with each passing day, not with bitterness, at least not at first, but with curiosity. I wanted to see how people constructed the appearance of innocence, how betrayal could wear the face of loyalty, how you could sit across from someone who had broken something sacred and still feel the pressure to smile. We shared dinners most evenings, simple meals, pasta with too much garlic, roasted chicken, store-bought lasagna. The food didn't matter. It was the ritual that held meaning now. We sat at the same table where my son used to blow out birthday candles, where my wife once insisted on placing cloth napkins even when we ordered takeout. They chatted easily during these meals, trading stories, making small jokes. I sat mostly in silence, chewing slowly, watching the space between them. There was always a space, a few inches of air that vibrated with something invisible and undeniable. They didn't touch. They didn't even glance at each other more than they should. But the restraint was the proof, the careful distance, the studied avoidance of familiarity. It was too deliberate. One evening, I caught a moment. It was so brief it might have meant nothing. She dropped a fork, and he bent down at the same time she did to pick it up. Their heads nearly touched. Their eyes met. And in that split second, I saw the flicker. Not surprise, not guilt, recognition. And then it was gone. The fork clattered to the floor again, and she laughed nervously. He chuckled, standing back up. She fetched another utensil. The moment passed. But I had seen it. After that, I began noticing more. The way she stood when he entered the room, her spine straightening almost unconsciously. The way his voice softened when he spoke to her, dropping half an octave. The small things. The tilt of her head when he spoke. The way he brushed lint from her shoulder once, so casually it felt planned. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. A quiet observer at a play I had never auditioned for. The house itself began to feel like part of the performance. The walls had ears now. The windows were complicit. Even the furniture seemed to settle into roles. My favorite chair felt colder. The table more distant. The hallway stretched longer at night, as if it resented my footsteps. I didn't confront them. That would have broken the spell, and I wasn't ready for what came after. Instead, I retreated further into myself, watching, listening, making mental notes. Every smile they gave me was weighed, every gesture catalogued. I began to wonder if they believed I didn't know, or if they simply didn't care anymore. There were moments I questioned my own mind. Grief does strange things. It warps perception. It makes shadows out of shapes. But I had never felt more alert, more awake. The betrayal had clarified my senses. I noticed things now I would have once overlooked. The way she wore lipstick when she knew he would be home. The way he lingered too long in the kitchen even after the coffee was poured. And always that unbearable politeness. The mask of decency stretched across their faces like thin skin. They performed concern. They asked about my sleep, my appetite, my walks. They left notes on the counter. Gone to the store. Took the car for a wash. Back by 5. Sweet, ordinary messages, each one a thread in the costume. I began to answer their questions with half smiles. I nodded at their stories. I passed the salt. I played my part in their farce. But every act built pressure in my chest. My heart became a clenched fist, my throat a tight rope. I began waking in the middle of the night with my jaw locked, my teeth aching from the tension. One afternoon, I watched them from the upstairs window. They were outside, watering the garden together. She wore a sun hat. He held the hose. They laughed at something, then stood in silence, admiring the lilies. The scene was picturesque, domestic. It could have been a postcard. But I saw the truth pulsing beneath the image. I saw the private current running between them, the electricity they thought they had hidden. I stepped away from the window before they looked up. Later, she brought me tea and placed it gently beside my chair. Her hand brushed mine as she did. Her eyes met mine. I held her gaze for a second longer than usual. She smiled, but I didn't return it. Something shifted in her face, only slightly. She knew then, or suspected, that I had seen through the mask, that I had begun to unthread the fabric of the story they were spinning. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my hands folded on my chest like a man waiting to be buried. I felt something cold and deep rising in me. Not hatred, not rage, but a silent resolve. The kind that didn't burn, but froze. I understood, finally, that they believed I was too old, too tired, too numb to do anything. That I would go on playing the role they assigned to me, that they had won. But the mask of decency, like all masks, eventually slips. And when it does, what's left underneath is not something they're prepared to see. I hadn't intended to go through his room. In truth, I had been avoiding it. The door had remained shut since the morning after the service, not out of ceremony, but because I couldn't bear to open it. Something about touching the things he left behind felt like disturbing a still surface, like stepping into a pond that had finally calmed after a storm. But the house had begun pressing in on me, the walls too quiet, the days too long. And so one afternoon, without much thought, I turned the knob and walked in. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old laundry, that soft masculine scent that lingered in the air like breath. The blinds were half drawn, filtering the sunlight into strips across the carpet. Dust floated lazily in the warm slats of light. Everything was as he had left it. The unwashed coffee mug on the desk, the rumpled shirt on the back of the chair, the half-read book with a folded corner beside the bed. The quiet in the room was different from the rest of the house. It didn't accuse or whisper. It simply waited. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what I was even looking for. I wasn't. I was just trying to remember the sound of his voice, the shape of his laughter. But memory is cruel in its timing. The harder I tried to summon him, the more elusive he became. I started small. I opened the drawer of his nightstand. Inside were things I expected. Old receipts, a dead pen, a pocket knife with a chipped blade. I moved on to the desk. Notebooks, a few bills, a worn photograph of his mother tucked into the corner of a book about home renovation. Her face smiled up at me, and I placed it gently aside. As I reached for a small wooden box on the shelf above the desk, something caught my eye. A glint of metal beneath the edge of the bed. I bent down slowly, knees stiff, and reached for it. My fingers closed around a cufflink. It was small, gold, and square-edged, one I recognized instantly. It belonged to my brother. There was no mistaking it. He had worn that set for years. I remembered them from weddings, job interviews, a retirement dinner he didn't enjoy. He used to joke that they were the only expensive thing he owned. He had misplaced one once at a hotel in Chicago, and we turned the room upside down, looking for it. I never forgot the pattern on its face, subtle diagonal lines, almost like grain on wood. And here it was, tucked in the corner of my dead son's bedroom floor, beside the leg of the bed, where it didn't belong. I didn't move for a long time. I sat there, hunched over, the metal cold in my palm, a weight far heavier than it should have been. There was no plausible explanation, not one I could entertain, not one that didn't sink my stomach and pull the breath from my chest. I thought about the night I had seen the light beneath her door. I thought about the way they moved in the house, choreographed and careful. I thought about the silence that had followed me from room to room, how it had curled around corners and pressed against my ears. And now, the silence had left a relic, a tiny shining thing that screamed louder than any voice ever could. I closed my fist around the cufflink and rose slowly. My knees protested. My breath trembled. I stared down at the floor where I had found it, as if expecting another one to reveal itself. But there was nothing else, just that one small thing, left behind. Forgotten, perhaps. Or maybe not. Maybe it had been dropped in haste during movement, or maybe it had been overlooked in the scramble to pretend nothing had happened. I walked out of the room, the cufflink still in my hand. I returned to my own room and sat on the edge of the bed. I turned the object over in my fingers again and again, its smooth surface warming slightly from the heat of my skin. I could have placed it back where I found it, pretended it wasn't there, told myself it had been borrowed, lost during a visit, left during some innocent moment I had forgotten. But the truth doesn't retreat once seen. It latches on, root deep. I set the cufflink on my nightstand. It gleamed dully in the afternoon light, indifferent to the pain it carried. I stared at it for a long time. My thoughts swirled, disjointed, furious, cold. There was no confrontation that would make it better, no demand that would restore what had been broken. My son was gone. My family was unrecognizable, and I was left with a symbol, a clue, a fragment of a truth that I hadn't been meant to hold. That evening, we sat around the table again. She served dinner. He poured the wine. Their movements were practiced, their conversation effortless. They laughed softly at some story about the neighbor's dog. I watched them. I watched the way her eyes didn't quite meet his, the way his hand hovered for a second too long near hers when passing the breadbasket, the way neither of them looked at me for more than a moment. I didn't say a word. I let the scene unfold. Later that night, when the dishes were done and the lights turned low, I returned to the nightstand and picked up the cufflink again. I held it to the lamp and studied every ridge, every curve. I thought about how objects don't lie. People do. Memories shift, words falter, but a thing is just what it is. Metal, cold, honest. I placed it in a small box and slid it into the back of my dresser drawer. It was no longer just jewelry. It was evidence, not for a courtroom, but for me. Proof that I had not imagined the undercurrent, that I had not mistaken grief for madness, that the threads I'd been pulling were leading somewhere real, and that somewhere, behind the masks, behind the smiles, behind the kindness, something had snapped loose. There is a point when betrayal stops being a wound and becomes a structure. Something you live inside of, something you walk through every day, breathing its air, touching its walls. That cufflink was the door, and I had just stepped through. The house began to change in ways I couldn't explain, though nothing moved. The furniture stayed in its place. The walls held their color. The doors opened and closed the same as they always had. And yet, something had shifted in the air. I noticed it first in the quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful or restful, but thick, like fog settling inside the lungs. I walked from room to room and found myself listening for footsteps that never came. The rooms were not empty, but they felt hollow. Every sound seemed to echo too long. I had always thought of loneliness as something loud, a kind of ache that made itself known. But this was different. This loneliness was quiet and precise. It didn't cry out. It pressed down, slowly, like a snowfall that smothers the ground before anyone notices it's there. I carried it with me through the hallways, down the stairs, into the yard. It followed me, not like a shadow, but like gravity. Each morning became a ritual of observation. I woke before either of them and sat by the kitchen window with a mug of coffee that I barely drank. I watched the wind move through the trees, the same trees I had planted with my son when he was 12. Back then, we had joked about how tall they'd grow, how one day they'd shade the whole yard. Now they cast long, reaching shadows across the grass, and I wondered if he would have liked how they turned out. I wondered if he would have kept them trimmed. I wondered if he would have replaced the fence, painted the porch, added a swing. I wondered too many things. In their absence, I found my thoughts growing louder. They didn't shout, but they pulsed. Every memory, every suspicion, every thread I had tried to ignore became louder in the silence. I tried to fill the days with tasks. I raked leaves that didn't need raking. I reorganized the same drawer twice. I scrubbed the kitchen sink with vinegar and lemon, not because it was dirty, but because it gave me 10 minutes where I didn't have to think. But the thoughts came anyway. I began taking walks around the block. I avoided neighbors. I turned corners quickly, lowered my head. I didn't want to explain the sadness in my eyes or the hollowness in my voice. I didn't want to be told it would pass. Some things don't pass. They settle in your bones. One afternoon, I sat on the edge of my son's bed and stared at the wall for almost an hour. The air in that room felt different, not heavier, emptier, the kind of emptiness that draws out the shape of what's missing. His books were still stacked by the bed. A small pair of reading glasses rested on the nightstand, half buried under unopened mail. I didn't touch them. I didn't need to. They reminded me of him without trying. The tilt of his head while he read, the way he tapped his fingers on the armrest when he was thinking, the faint whistle he made through his teeth when lost in thought. I heard all of it now, but only in memory. Downstairs, their laughter floated through the walls like the sound of a party I hadn't been invited to. Not boisterous or obvious, just quiet, casual, and persistent. It stung more than shouting ever could have. It reminded me that I was no longer a participant in this household. I had become something between an artifact and a shadow, present, but no longer seen. At night, the house became unbearably loud in its stillness. I lay awake listening to the settling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car on the road outside. I imagined what they talked about behind closed doors. I imagined the words they didn't say to me. I imagined how easily they smiled when I left the room. My mind filled in the gaps with a cruel kind of precision. I didn't cry, not because I didn't feel pain, but because even tears require energy. I felt drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. My body moved like it was made of stone. I washed my hands too often. I cleaned the same windows 3 times. I checked the mailbox every day, even when I knew nothing would be there. I opened my journal and tried to write again. The page remained blank for 15 minutes before I set the pen down and closed the cover. My thoughts were too heavy for paper. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked older than I remembered. My skin had lost its color. My eyes had darkened beneath the sockets. I leaned in and studied my face as if it belonged to someone else. I traced the lines around my mouth, the folds at the corner of my eyes, and wondered when I had stopped being visible, when I had become a fixture instead of a person. I returned to the living room, sat in my chair, and stared at the photograph on the mantel, the one of the 3 of us. I didn't reach for it. I simply looked, as if it might shift under my gaze and offer a different version of the story. But it never did. The smile on my wife's face remained the same. My son's arm still draped casually across my shoulders. My own expression frozen somewhere between pride and surprise. A moment sealed forever, untouched by what came after. The loneliness I felt wasn't just about being alone. It was about being erased, slowly, gently, like chalk under the rain. I was still here, and yet I was not part of what the house had become. I moved through it like a guest overstaying his welcome. I ate meals that had no taste. I responded to questions with nods and hums. I opened drawers, then closed them without taking anything out. One night, I sat outside on the back steps and watched the stars. The air was cool and dry. The grass smelled of earth. I counted planes overhead, their blinking lights crossing the sky like thoughts that would never land. I thought of my son again. I whispered his name to the dark, not expecting an answer. No answer came, and yet, in the silence that followed, I realized I had stopped waiting for one. Loneliness wasn't the absence of people. It was the absence of being seen, being understood, being remembered for the right reasons. I was still in the house, still in the world, still breathing. But I had become invisible. And invisibility, I was learning, weighs more than anything I had ever carried. Trust doesn't shatter in a single blow. It unravels, quietly. It loosens in the background like a fraying thread you don't notice until the whole fabric is falling apart in your hands. By the time I admitted to myself that I no longer trusted them, it wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation, something that had already rotted through, even if the surface still looked solid. They continued on as if nothing had changed. My brother moved through the house with confidence, as though each day granted him more ownership. He began suggesting things, small ones at first, rearranging the tools in the shed, replacing a light fixture in the hallway, trimming back the hedges. He spoke like a man who assumed agreement, as if the house, once mine, had become ours. He used that word often. We should paint this wall. We could move the old recliner to the garage. We ought to think about fixing the upstairs shower. I nodded, said little, watched more. My daughter-in-law became quieter around me, not in a way that drew attention, but subtly. Her words were shorter, her smile more reserved. When we crossed paths in the hallway or brushed past each other in the kitchen, I could feel her carefulness, the calculation in her movements. She was guarding something, or pretending not to. One afternoon, I found her in my study. She said she was looking for stamps. I didn't question her, but after she left, I checked the desk drawers. Nothing was missing, and yet I still felt disturbed, like someone had stepped into a private room and breathed too deeply. The air in the study lingered differently for the rest of the day. My routines began to splinter. I avoided shared spaces. I waited longer in the mornings before entering the kitchen. I took my coffee outside or up to my bedroom. I no longer turned on the television in the evenings because it brought us together in a room where I couldn't bear the performance. I started locking the door to my room at night, not out of fear, but as a final gesture to what remained of my privacy. The house felt unfamiliar now. The air felt touched. My possessions moved slightly, subtly, in ways that were easy to dismiss if you didn't know them well. But I did. I knew which books leaned which way on the shelf. I knew how the pantry door never quite closed unless pushed from the top corner. I knew the sounds of drawers, the angle of opened windows, the rhythm of movement through these walls. And I felt it changing. I felt them changing it. I overheard snippets of conversation. Nothing direct, nothing confessional, just moments that didn't include me. Whispers through thin walls, the murmur of laughter behind a closed door. One night, while I stood in the hallway with a glass of water, I caught the end of a sentence through her door. My name, followed by silence. And then, a low male voice. Then nothing. That was the moment the last thread broke. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, the water untouched. I stared at the floor, The hardwood boards I had installed myself years ago. I remembered the feel of the nail gun in my hand, the ache in my knees from hours of crouching. I had made this place, with care, with purpose, for a family. And now it belonged to people I couldn't trust. I thought about the past again, about the first time I loaned my brother money decades ago when he needed help after losing his job. I thought about the time he crashed his car, and I was the one who drove 3 hours in the middle of the night to pick him up from the side of the road. I thought about the secrets we had shared as boys, the kind only brothers know how to carry for each other. And I realized I had always wanted to believe in him more than I actually did. He had charm, always. He could speak his way out of anything. People liked him, women especially. He knew when to smile, when to lower his voice, when to place a hand gently on someone's shoulder. I used to think of it as a gift. Now I saw it differently, as instinct, as strategy. She had her own methods, her quietness, her grace, her ability to disarm with softness. She knew how to play the role of daughter-in-law. She was careful, deferential, quick with a thank you, a warm gesture, a moment of concern. But behind that warmth, I now saw the tension in her jaw, the flicker in her eyes when I entered a room unannounced. I saw how quickly her body shifted when she thought she was alone. They were playing a long game. Of that I was certain. One that involved staying close, managing appearances, maintaining a kind of domestic theater in which I was both the host and the target. I began to notice paperwork going missing. Not important things at first. A water bill, a letter from the bank. I kept my documents in a file drawer in the study, organized by year and category. I never misplaced things. I had built my life on order. But pages were moving. Folders weren't flush. Envelopes that had been sealed were no longer perfectly closed. I placed a piece of tape across the edge of one drawer, barely visible, a sliver of clear plastic that would tear if opened. 2 days later, it was torn. I didn't confront them. I didn't speak a word. Instead, I began quietly moving things. My passport, my insurance documents, the title to the house. I stored them in a safe deposit box at a bank 10 miles away. I kept the key in my pocket. I checked it once a week, even though I hadn't told anyone where it was. Trust was gone. What remained was vigilance. I watched them the way one watches a fire that hasn't quite gone out, knowing that even the smallest gust of wind could reignite it. I measured their tone, their distance, the pause between their sentences. I listened for the coded language of people who thought they were being clever. I wondered what they wanted. I wondered how far it would go. I wondered what they told themselves to make it okay. But mostly, I wondered how much longer they believed I was blind. The collapse of trust isn't loud. It doesn't leave shattered glass or raised voices. It leaves silence. A silence that grows, spreads, thickens like mold. And once it settles, it never really leaves. I lived with that silence now. It sat with me at breakfast. It followed me down the hall. It tucked itself into the corners of every room I entered. And though they smiled and offered tea and asked about my sleep, I knew. And knowing was all I had left. There came a point when the tension no longer needed a reason to exist. It became the backdrop, the very fabric of our lives. Like the constant low hum of a refrigerator, it was always there, beneath the surface, vibrating through the walls, humming through the floorboards, pulsing behind every casual smile, every clink of silverware, every word exchanged. I didn't know exactly when the moment of decision had arrived. But one morning, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back at me, I understood that I had already crossed the threshold. I began the preparations in quiet. The first step was to vanish in plain sight. I made myself smaller, slower. I answered questions with gentle nods, excused myself earlier in the evenings, faked naps in the afternoon. I stopped checking the mail in front of them. I stopped reading the paper at the kitchen table. I shifted my routines just slightly, enough to be noticed but not questioned. I needed them to grow comfortable again. I needed them to believe I had grown passive. But I was awake, and I was moving. In the back of the closet in the study, behind a stack of old newspapers and a broken printer, there was a fireproof lockbox I hadn't touched in years. I remembered the weight of it before I even reached for it. Inside were the documents I had tucked away before: insurance policies, investment records, the original deed to the house. I placed them on the desk one by one, laying them flat, smoothing the edges, taking stock of what still belonged to me and what never would again. I drafted new instructions, a quiet set of papers to redirect the future. I rewrote the will, line by line, with a steady hand and no hesitation. I removed names. I erased entitlements. I gave freely to institutions that would never betray me, and to one name that would matter long after the two of them were gone. My grandson, a boy too young to understand the weight of legacy, but untouched by the rot that had crept into this house. The attorney was a man I had known through the church, quiet, discreet. I didn't give him details. I only told him the papers needed to be updated, witnessed, filed properly. He didn't ask questions. He came to the house when I knew they would be gone. Some fabricated errand, some conveniently timed appointment. The signature was quick, the seal even quicker. By the time they returned, everything had changed, and nothing looked different. I made copies and stored them in 3 places, one at the bank, one in a box I mailed to a friend across the state with no return address, and one beneath the false bottom of a drawer in the garage, behind an old tin of screws they would never bother to open. I began cleaning out the basement, not in haste, not in full, but enough to make room. There were things down there I didn't need anymore. Old furniture, rusted tools, boxes of things that belonged to lives no longer being lived. I gave some of it away, burned some of it, moved others to the curb. Each item removed was a step toward clarity, a way of stripping the house down to what mattered. I didn't do this for revenge. That was never the point. This wasn't about punishment. It was about preservation of what remained of me, of the man I used to be, before silence became my only language. In the evenings, I took longer walks. I spoke to fewer people. I passed the same houses I had seen for 20 years and imagined them empty. I wondered what kind of quiet lived in those homes, if it was the kind that soothed or the kind that grew teeth. I visited the cemetery one afternoon. I hadn't been back since the funeral. The grass had grown over the edge of the stone. I brushed it away with the edge of my boot, then bent down and cleaned it with the sleeve of my jacket. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't bring words. I brought presents. And I left with the understanding that there would be no second act, no return of what I had lost, only the story I would choose to write from here. When I returned home, I noticed how their voices dropped to a hush when I entered a room, how they stopped mid-sentence, how she moved her phone slightly out of sight when I walked into the kitchen, how his hand twitched near his pocket, as if hiding something he couldn't afford to lose. I never asked. I didn't need to. They had built their story. I was simply removing myself from its pages. On the 3rd Tuesday of the month, I received a call from the financial advisor I had worked with for over a decade. I had transferred several accounts, quietly. He confirmed everything was in place. He asked if I needed assistance. I said no. I thanked him. That was the last time I would speak to him. I sat at my desk that night and lit the lamp with the green glass shade. My son had once said it made me look like an old banker. I had kept it for that reason. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote my final letter. Not one of farewell, but of fact. I didn't explain or accuse. I simply named things for what they were. It was the only gift I had left to give them. Truth, I sealed the letter and placed it in an envelope marked, "Not to be opened until I'm gone." I left it in the drawer beside my bed. They would find it. Eventually. In the last week, I stopped responding to their invitations. I skipped dinner. I spent more time in the garden, pruning plants I no longer had the strength to save. I left the hose running once and let it flood the lawn. I watched the water soak into the dirt and wondered how deep it would reach. At night, I kept the window open, let the cold air in. I needed to feel something clean again. I did not look them in the eye when they spoke to me. Not because I was afraid of what I'd see, but because I knew they weren't speaking to me anymore. They were speaking to the idea of me, the shell, the obstacle, the ghost that still lived among them. But I wasn't a ghost. Not yet. And I would not let my silence be mistaken for surrender. I had prepared for this. The house could keep its noise. I was preparing for silence. Real silence. Mine. The morning it happened was ordinary in every visible way. The sky was a dull gray, neither threatening rain nor offering sun. The air had the stale scent of late summer. Dust, dying grass, distant exhaust from the garbage truck making its way down the block. In the kitchen, the old refrigerator hummed softly. The coffee brewed the way it always did, filling the house with a scent that no longer belonged to anyone in particular. The house made its sounds, the same creaks, the same clicks, familiar and meaningless. And yet, everything was different. I had woken before them. I always did. I sat in the den with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and listened to the house exhale. I knew their steps by now, the weight of them, the rhythm. I knew how she padded down the stairs first, always in socks. I knew how his heavier footfalls followed a minute later. I could time them down to the second. But that morning, I didn't listen for their approach. I waited for it, not as a victim, not as an observer, as someone who had completed the final stitch in a long, patient pattern. I had lived among ghosts. The ghost of my son, certainly, but also the ghost of myself, the man I used to be before suspicion turned to certainty, before memory was replaced by evidence. But I was done haunting these halls in silence. The reckoning had been written already, quietly, neatly, without malice, but with precision. I sat at the dining room table and placed the envelope in the center. They came into the room like it was any other morning. He mumbled something about the paper. She asked if I wanted toast. I said nothing. I pushed the envelope forward with 2 fingers and stood up. I left the room before they could ask. I didn't wait for the moment of reading, the widening of eyes, the stumble of breath. I didn't need to see it. That part wasn't mine. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me. The air was crisp and unfamiliar, the kind of air that only arrives after something has ended, or begun. I walked down the steps, my shoes quiet on the wood I had stained years ago with my own hands, hands that had once built a home and now released it. I had given them everything they didn't know they were holding: copies of legal documents, a copy of the revised will, a breakdown of the financial transfers, a letter that held no accusation, only truth. I told them what I saw, when I saw it. I told them how the cufflink found its place. I told them how silence had never meant blindness. They would read it, and they would understand that the performance was over. I had stripped the story bare, removed the illusions. I left them with reality, sealed in paper, signed with quiet rage. I walked to the bench near the edge of the park, the one facing the grove where my son once played catch with me. I sat there for a long while. The trees were still. A few squirrels rustled in the brush. Birds called out, distant and indifferent. The world was turning, unchanged by what had shifted in mine. And I felt calm, not victorious, not vengeful. Calm in the way a man feels when he has nothing left to guard. I did not return home for hours. I let them sit with it. with the silence that came after the truth, because truth doesn't need a voice. It echoes in the things it takes away. When I came back, the house was quiet, in a new way. She wasn't in the kitchen. He wasn't in the living room. A suitcase rested by the door. I didn't ask whose it was. I didn't care. They didn't speak to me. Not that day. Not the next. But things began to vanish. Her car disappeared one morning, her perfume no longer lingering in the hallway. His toolbox was gone 2 days later. A few drawers in the guest room stood open and empty. The laughter that had once bounced from room to room dissolved without fanfare. And I didn't mourn its absence. It had never belonged. I ate dinner alone, the way I had expected to all along. I cleaned the dishes slowly. The silence in the house no longer suffocated. It cleared the air. The walls no longer listened. They relaxed. I moved through each room like a man reclaiming something. Not space, not power, but peace. The photographs on the wall remained, but I no longer glanced away when passing them. My son's face looked back at me, not with sorrow, but with something closer to understanding. In the evenings, I opened the windows and let the cool air move through. I left the bedroom door open again. I read by the light of the old lamp, its shade cracked but still glowing. I folded the laundry the way I liked it folded. I let the radio play the songs I had missed while pretending not to exist. And for the first time in months, the house belonged to silence that healed, not silence that hid. There would be no confrontation, no screaming, no slammed doors. That wasn't how this was ever going to end. Some truths are too complete for noise. They settle like dust after a long storm, soft and final. What I gave them wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a mirror, a clear one, held up without shaking. And they chose not to look into it. That was their reckoning. Mine was already complete. I sat on the porch that night with a blanket over my knees and a cup of lukewarm tea. I watched the last of the leaves fall from the elm. The wind was still. The stars came out without permission. And for once, I did not wait for footsteps behind me. I had given them my silence, and in the end, it spoke louder than any word ever could.